On March 4th, 2022, Microsoft completed their third largest acquisition in history. Was it LinkedIn? Skype? Maybe Activision? No, it was a health tech company you probably never heard of, Nuance Communications. Nuance is a leader in conversational AI and have been working on voice recognition technology for decades. But what made this $19.7 billion acquisition so appealing? And why were Microsoft willing to pay a 23% premium? From the surface, you might assume this acquisition was a strategic play to perhaps improve Microsoft's Cortana so it can finally start competing with the likes of Siri and Alexa. But if you thought this, you couldn't be more wrong. Here's Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella to explain.
If you think about this, it always starts for us with our mission to empower people and organizations. And in this case, it's about healthcare. It's about the patients, it's about doctors, it's about health outcomes. And Nuance and Mark and team have done a fantastic job of taking perhaps the most defining technology of our times, artificial intelligence, applying it in the most critical of industries, healthcare.
The real reason was the strategic chess move amidst Microsoft's grander ambitions to dominate the healthcare industry. Nuance's products like Dragon Medical One and DAX are leading clinical speech recognition tools used and trusted by physicians globally. This deep market penetration and influence within the health industry is really what Microsoft are looking to capitalize on. I'm joined with Dr. Simon Wallace, the Chief Clinical Information Officer at Nuance, to discuss why Microsoft acquired Nuance for $20 billion and the impact it will have on healthcare. Please make sure you subscribe, and I hope you enjoy. When a company is acquired by a huge tech giant, whether it's Microsoft, Google, there's often worry that the companies will lose creative control of their overall mission. But from my understanding, Microsoft have always been very flexible in their acquisitions, whether it's LinkedIn, GitHub, Activision. They don't really impede on that existing vision, but instead almost provide these unlimited resources to accelerate that vision and mission. And so why was it particularly exciting to have the backing of Microsoft, and how has this acquisition enhanced Nuance's capabilities and resource beyond just healthcare, but actually this overall grander tech communication company?
It's a really good question and an important question. When we first heard that this may be in the mix, I guess we all had similar thoughts. But both Microsoft and Nuance have been in the healthcare space for many years. And actually, our various solutions that we have are very complementary. And certainly by merging not just the various technologies, but the people from both our organizations, that has resulted in a very symbiotic relationship.
For someone that isn't necessarily aware about Nuance's products, could you maybe talk about, beyond just healthcare, the enterprise services that they also offer?
When Microsoft acquired Nuance, they acquired two parts of Nuance. There was the healthcare section, and there was also the enterprise section. And part of the enterprise section was around bringing voice technologies to the business community. And an example of that your listeners may know is My Voice is My Password. They may have experienced that if they have been communicating with their bank over the telephone. And just like we have a unique fingerprint, we also have a unique voice biometric. And there's been a whole load of interesting studies done about the one-to-one relationship of our voice and the profile that it creates. And that led to this technology of My Voice is My Password, which, as I said, is used in a number of UK businesses today.
I think we could probably talk about that enterprise section for a whole different podcast, but this is of course a health related podcast, and you are of course a doctor, and so we're going to focus on specifically healthcare, but I think that context is going to be useful for a lot of listeners. And so within healthcare, I think the main impact that Nuance is having is, of course, as you mentioned, the AI speech to text recognition software in the context of clinical documentations. And the pandemic for a lot of people really highlighted some reoccurring themes regarding workplace stress and strain amongst health professionals. And a huge part of that strain and stress was because of the piling loads of clinical documentations and administration work, paperwork. And so how is Nuance alleviating those common themes that are discussed in the news still today?
We did a survey last year where we were trying to assess how big a burden clinical documentation is on clinicians. And we found that in an average working week, and we're talking 37 and a half hours, 13 and a half hours per week was spent simply creating clinical documentation. An additional 3.2 hours was done in the clinician's own time. And it was actually worse for consultants, I think, around the whole outpatient letter creation. And I think what even surprised me even more was that was an increase of over 25% over the last 7 years. So we compared it to 7 years ago. So that's really not great. And we did another survey just before the second lockdown of COVID, where 85% of all the respondents agreed that the burden of clinical documentation was a significant contributor to burnout. But documentation is key to record the patient's journey, and doing that well in the EPR. And there's a whole separate question about the increased time that clinicians spend in EPRs. So it has to be done because knowledge and availability of knowledge is key for continuity of a good quality patient journey. But it's a real chore. And as I said earlier, not just for doctors, but for all healthcare professionals. The fact that we speak 3 times faster than we can type is where time can be given back by using one's voice to create a note, whatever that might be, an admission note, an ED note, a discharge letter, an outpatient letter. That's really key. And it's also key for the quality of the document. Your listeners will often, I hope, just know that doing all that typing, they may cut a few corners. They may leave out the pertinent negatives. It's good to know that there was no blood in the phlegm, that there was no swelling of the ankles. And pertinence are just as important as the positive findings. And it's also about timely availability of documentation. If a patient's seen an outpatient or discharged and something crops up and they go back to their GP 24, 48 hours later and the GP doesn't have that information, it just breaks the cycle of good quality care. And one doctor told me, he said, but by using speech, I'm not focusing on typing, but I can think more about the note I'm creating and be much more in that zone of clinical thinking rather than mechanical typing.
And I think there's 2 aspects to this, right? The first aspect is, in my experience anyway, either doctors will eat into their non-work time to finish documentation for patient notes, or they'll take poor notes and miss important information, and then that itself brings up a whole load of medical legal issues. And I see it on the ward all the time. The F1 will be scribbling rough notes, trying to keep up with the fast-paced ward round, trying to listen to the consultant, miss one part of the patient plan, and then that's not documented. And so that's one aspect. But I think the second aspect is the fact that there's also a deeper intrinsic benefit to enhance patient care, and clinicians can actually spend more time on those patient-facing responsibilities. And so could you touch on how the technology is allowing us to practice medicine, how it's supposed to be practiced? It's an exercise of our imagination with an emphasis on empathy. And so how is it that technology like the ones that Nuance are offering allows us to focus on that empathy and actually enhance the patient-facing responsibilities?
It's a key question, and I see it like the way you described, spending so much time just documenting and actually missing out on that journey of learning, gaining clinical experience, having that closer empathy with the patient, because there's this agenda, isn't there, to get the notes complete as best and can. The whole concept of speech is the ability to have real-time creation of that note that is as the doctor would want it. It's got the content and quality that it should have, and it frees up time for more of that patient-focused time. And often in the marketing literature, we talk about it's more time for doctors to spend with their patients. Yes, absolutely. But for me, it's also about the doctor's well-being. It's also about getting home on time. It's about those well-earned and much-earned tea breaks, lunch breaks, and going to weekly education meetings. So I think that will help. I know I've seen evidence of that helping, chipping away at the stress and burnout that's plaguing clinicians so much today.
And as you alluded to earlier, a huge aspect of Microsoft's impact on healthcare and life sciences is twofold. So one aspect is, of course, the Azure cloud. And I had Dr. Umang Patel on the podcast to discuss that, and I'll be leaving that episode as a link in the description for anyone who wants to check it out. And then there's also this other aspect now, which is the natural language processing AI, and of course evidenced by the significant investment in OpenAI. And so this must open new kind of horizons for Nuance's products in the clinical setting beyond just actually speech to text recognition.
I think this is one of the most exciting pieces of the acquisition, because what I'm about to describe, it's that combination of the power of both organizations being able to bring this type of technology to market much, much faster. So let me give you an example. This solution is called DAX Copilot, and a lot of your listeners will know that Microsoft is creating a whole series of copilots, particularly in the healthcare space. And this is one that was launched in the US just recently. And what it does, so pretend that you're the doctor, I'm the patient, and we're having either an outpatient consultation, or I might be in the GP surgery. I could be face to face with you, or we could be having a remote discussion, a bit like we are with this podcast. And I record our consultation through an app, through the DAX Copilot app on my mobile phone. And at the end of that consultation, I stop the recording, and within seconds, the whole transcript, word for word, is produced. That's okay, but the ambient and generative AI in the background has created a structured note with the key bits under relevant headings. So the history of the present illness, the family history, the medicines that the patient's on, any allergies, the examination I did, and then with my recommendation and plan. All the sort of conversation that we might have that is, did you have a nice holiday, or the ums and ahs, all that gets taken out. And so it is a summary of what the clinician would type or have his secretary type up if this technology didn't exist. So for me, in summary, it's a real game changer in the chore of clinical documentation. And you talked about the opportunity of now Nuance being part of the Microsoft family. It's giving the ability to bring that to market in countries outside of the US much more quickly, and to do innovative things as well. For example, when a patient gets their outpatient letter, it's often too technical, isn't it? The generative AI can turn that into a letter of a reading age where that medical terminology, etc., is much more understandable. Different languages for patients, and a whole host of other clinical applications down the track.
Yeah, it's intriguing. And I think when getting excited about tech and when talking about the adoption of tech, we see that classic bell-shaped curve where we get those early adopters being the minority, whilst the majority being those late adopters. And we see this in practice. We're beginning to see some specialties, whether it's radiologist or some other specialties, ENT, moving away from typing on keyboards, but actually dictating speech to text. However, in my experience, many primary care doctors haven't made that shift yet. They still use the keyboard. And then a step behind that is in the hospital setting, everyone's still using pen and paper. And so despite actually hospital settings and primary care, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of many others being in the biggest need for transformation, they are the most resistant to that change. And so what is the cultural shift that needs to take place so that we can start seeing more innovative clinical documentation processes being seen in clinical practice?
I tend to say the technology works today. It really does. You just put a microphone into a doctor's hand or a nurse's hand or an allied health professional's hand, let them try it, and they'll see the text come out on screen. They'll go, oh, wow, okay, that does work. But you're absolutely right. Part of the challenge is the cultural side of things. And it's all about a change project. It's all about clinical transformation. And it doesn't matter whether it's speech, whether it's EPRs, whether it's a new form of diagnostic technology. It's a change project. The philosophy of change and the principles of change need to be part of that when it becomes implemented. So we've gone from the pen, as you say, to typing, to voice. It's one of those cultural sort of shifts. As I said, the first thing is demonstrate it works and show that it's easy. But then it's finding those clinical champions. In the NHS, we're very lucky compared to other countries. We have that role of the CCIO, the Chief Clinical Information Officer, to be that sort of voice for the clinical community. There are also Chief Nursing Information Officers as well, and pharmacists and others are coming into that component. But there's also the need for clinical champions within each clinical specialty. Dermatology is a very different beast compared to orthopedics, for example. I think when a project like this starts off, it's very important to have clinicians right from the very beginning looking at how this project of implementing speech is going to work. It's all about workflow. How is it going to be used in their certain EPR they may have, in the certain clinical setting that they may be in? It's workflow, workflow, workflow. And I think the other thing is when a technology is implemented, so when speech is implemented, there's that at the elbow support. They're in the outpatient department. It's having someone there that they can ask straight away. And it might be something very minor, like a microphone driver on a particular PC is not quite set up properly. But not sorting that out straight away will then put speech in a negative vein, which is a bit unfair because it was something that was that had been overlooked or hadn't been fixed straight away. And I think if doctors do have criticisms, acknowledge these and try and solve them straight away.
I think part of this resistance to change is, of course, you fear what you don't know. And we've seen that with every big innovation. It was the car, the airplane. And now we're starting to see that with generative AI. And to have an AI listen to your most vulnerable conversation and be utilized in the documentation process is somewhat Black Mirror, right? Like, I have some patients that, despite me being a final year medical student, soon to be doctor, they aren't comfortable with me sitting in the consultation room and will politely ask for me to step out. And so the thought of some people having this unknown entity listening to the conversation and then within seconds write up a document, it can be somewhat uncomfortable. So how do we address that? You alluded to privacy concerns earlier, and I assume that's probably another big worry for many people. So how do we address this discomfort amongst the general populations also?
Yeah, so two bits. One, there's that clinician-patient interaction, and then there's the technology that sits behind. And I hinted earlier that before any consultation that goes on at the moment using DAX Copilot in the US, the clinician sits and asks the patient for their permission to do this and gives some explanation about why it's being done, but also the safety and the security that sits behind it. Not quite analogous, but giving consent for an operation, you need to go through with some explanation about what that is and that side of it. And I think we'll probably learn more as we do more of these things on getting reactions back from patients. But at the moment, the overall feeling from patients is, oh, good, if this is going to improve my quality of care, then, and you say to me it's safe, then that is great. Now, the next thing is it's safety. And I think that, unfortunately, the world we live in, cybersecurity, we keep on reading things in the press, don't we, about data breaches, all that side of it. And I think it's one of the most fundamental, important roles that chief information officers in hospitals have today, and likewise commercial organizations providing services have today. Microsoft's number one priority and their whole DNA is around data privacy, confidentiality, and cybersecurity. With all our processes now under that Microsoft umbrella, those threats are now at an absolute minimum. And of course, they're constantly being addressed because the individuals out there who want to try and breach those are always trying to get ahead of the game. And there's a communication component here, isn't there? That, first of all, our clinical staff are comfortable and confident with the security side of things, and they can then portray that to their patients. And just in the way, I guess, banking in the early days, people were saying, oh, I'm not so sure about that. But now it is just part of the way we do things. The same journey, I think, will go with what we're doing here. But it's our job to communicate that we've done everything possible to make that environment secure.
There's something there which you said was very intriguing to me, which was around gaining consent for a patient. And part of that aspect of gaining consent is explaining a procedure, as you mentioned. And me being a final year medical student who is interested in tech innovation has been pushing for universities to include some kind of education in the curriculum around tech that is transforming healthcare, but there's been a lot of resistance. And so the question is, do you think it should start being a required mandatory competency for clinicians to be able to start explaining these tech? Whether it is a patient comes into me and says, I was diagnosed by ChatGPT, what does that mean for me? Or whether it is you're explaining Nuance's technology, the necessity of it, how it works, and addressing those fears that a patient will have.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm just about to start a mentoring program, actually, with a number of clinicians. And it's a 6-month journey where a group of us are going to be exploring some of the challenges they have with the digital world and how that plays into the clinical component. A number of them are on a journey to being clinical leaders, and some of them being clinical leaders in the digital health space. What I've asked them to do is to pick 1 or 2 tasks that they're going to be doing over the next 6 months in the digital health space that they're able to share, where we can work together to work through some of the challenges they may have. There may be cultural challenges. There may be challenges of just understanding the technology. There may be a host of other challenges, resistance, that sort of thing. And so I think that we have our clinical education, don't we? And that's great. But digital is going to play such a big role, then we really do have to get competent with a language to be able to, first of all, understand how the technology is working, but then to be able to communicate that with patients. But your question was more, should this be integral to medical school education? Absolutely, yes. And I don't have enough knowledge on how much of that has been done at those grassroots levels. But I would say that if it's not there in the amount and volume it should be, then it should be addressed, because it is the game in town that's going to support clinicians going forward.
And so as we close the podcast, I want to talk about an American computer scientist, author, and world-renowned futurist, and that is Ray Kurzweil. And he's most notably known for his concepts around the AI singularity. But what many people won't know, and I didn't know until I was researching into Nuance, is that it's especially fitting to ask the question because Ray was involved in the formation of Nuance in its infancy stages. So his company was called Kurzweil Computer Products. That was then sold to Scansoft, which was then renamed to Nuance. So my question is, in Ray's definition of the AI singularity, he describes it as a point in which machines and humans will merge. And I think when we discuss the capabilities of Nuance, I would argue that we're starting to see this merge between man and machine. And so do you think we are at the singularity that Ray was referring to? And if yes, how do we sensitively and responsibly navigate this for healthcare's future? And not just healthcare's future, humanity's future.
What a question to finish off on. We could have a whole podcast on this, couldn't we, really? Not just in healthcare, but in other aspects of our life. I would say that technology, whatever it is, it needs to be positioned as a tool. And it needs to be positioned as a tool to make the life of that clinician easier and to deliver the best quality healthcare possible. If you take another area in diagnostics, for example, do radiologists want to be churning through thousands of routine x-rays, such as chest x-rays that have come from either pre-op checks or from ED, where a large percentage are normal? If the AI can do that and do it safely, that's the key thing, can do it safely, then the clinician can spend more time on the abnormals and give more quality time and reflection on their feedback. And it reduces that stress, it reduces that sort of pressure, which then leads, unfortunately, to clinical error. There's so much we need to do as clinicians, and the key question is, how can an AI tool give that time back for more focused clinical care? And I'll say it again, providing, of course, it's safe. Clinicians that are listening, in your own clinical specialties, there'll be different sort of pressures and importance that you need to address. How can AI do that? And just finally, our patients actually will always want that human touch, that reassuring hand on the shoulder to say, everything's going to be fine. We can sort this out for you and make you better. And AI cannot do that, but it can support the clinical community try to meet that end.
Fantastic. Simon, it's been my absolute pleasure having you on this podcast. It's been such a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, and thanks for letting me have the time to speak to your listeners.